Hi, welcome to my Fireside Stories number 2. This is based on a true story that happened to my dad when he was in the RAF during the war, when he was training in Canada in 1942. He was training to be a pilot. And this one's written by my good friend Anthony Crawford and myself. So here we are, A Flight into Madness by John Ebrington, which is my nom de plume, and Anthony Crawford. So here we go, A Flight into Madness by John Ebrington and Anthony Crawford. Like Harold Macmillan once said, events, dear boy, events. Events are what bring down tyrants. Events are the very stuff of history. Faced with events such as those that bring disaster to the powerful, poor mortals such as us tend to look for conspirators, plotters plotting the downfall of the great. Nowadays, people look to the alignment of the sun and the moon, the movement of the stars and the time of birth. People are desperate for explanations to everything to discover some order, to avoid the possibility that after all is said and done, chance, and only chance, is the one explanation for the things that happen to us. Me? All I know is events. Even now, when I consider what occurred to one minor despot so long ago, I can offer no explanation as to how those so young as we were then could bring so low, so swiftly, one who believed himself to be so powerful. All I can do is describe to you the events as they unfolded. Canada, 1942, RAF training. Perhaps it was my dual nationality, born in Lyon to a French mother, aged 17, I moved to the village of my English father's youth as the Nazis moved in on Paris. Yes, I think it was the mix of French and English that provided my childhood with wonderful, curious cultural contradictions. In spite of the dreadful tyranny at the camp, I loved every minute because of the melting pot of cultures that were there. Only about 25% of the men at the camp actually came from Britain. The rest? Well, there were Aussies. From the rowdiness and the general bawdy antics, you would think they were the most numerous, but of course they weren't. They were instead a sizable number of French and British Canadians. There were Africans, North Africa mainly, Algeria, Morocco, some from Kenya, and as far away as Rhodesia, as it was then called. Of course, there were plenty of free French, and the bravest of all, the loners, mostly those whose loyalties were to ideology or to resistance to Hitler's tyranny, true men from Jamaica, Argentina, and India. They came from all over the world to help us. You know, racists today ignore this. Then, of course, there were our instructors. Of those who managed to survive 30 or so raids over Germany, they were declared unfit for further service due to any one of a number of maladies, ranging from anxiety to panic attacks to just plain bonkers. Their symptoms? Well, to see their symptoms, one had to experience their teaching. Anything might happen during the training flight, often doing outrageous aerial manoeuvres such as hedge hopping to worry the cattle. My instructor was a Yank, a splendid jazz musician, pianist. They say he'd been professional before the war, and any night you liked, he would carry on playing until the small hours, provided he was kept supplied with whiskey. So, when we took off the following morning for instruction, he would say over the intercom, "Do what you damn well like. I'm going to have a sleep." These were the mad. dispatched to prepare young fools for the madness to come. But insanity of a kind came to visit sooner than any of us expected. As I said, the Aussies were a right bunch of characters, always in the shower block. They were sprucing themselves up in the hope of impressing the young ladies in the bar that night. I remember they'd always sing a comical version of Waltzing Matilda. Couldn't repeat it here. There was this wiry old sergeant who, despite his thin frame, would bellow really loudly. He would tell them off. "Shut your big fat Aussie foul-mouthed gobs," he'd shout, till later that night when he was drunk. Then he'd say, "Come on, lads, let's hear that song again." I admired the brashness of the Aussies, being keen on the ladies one night before they went to a dance. They all stuffed a banana down the front of their trousers in the hope of making a favourable impression. However, they gave the game away by thrusting their gyrations and smirks on their faces. Flight Sergeant was responsible for discipline, and we called him Flight. The evening I arrived at the camp, he summons us new recruits to the assembly hall and he gave us a pep talk. Big man he was, in every sense, about 6'2", bulging out of his uniform, at the neck and above the waist belt, covered by a layer of blubber he was, and his hands, he always waved his hands around. His big fat fingers looked like a couple of bunches of uncooked sausages. He had a broken nose, and he had the broken nose of a boxer, and he squinted at us through small round specks with thick lenses magnifying his eyes. Sometimes he'd come up right to your face, peering at you with his big eyes. He'd swear he thought you were up to something. Terrifying he was. As he talked, Flight dribbled from his fat, fleshy lips, and he shouted. Blimey, how Flight shouted. He didn't stop. What was it he used to say? Yeah, I remember now. That was it. Play the game with me, lads. But when Flight said this, he always would lower his voice in a menacing manner. You play the game with me, and I'll play the game with you. He played games all right. We didn't dare play games with him, though. One of the things he used to do after showers, he'd make us jog back to the barracks, dressed only in our underpants. This, by the way, was in the middle of winter in Canada. Hell, you can imagine how cold we were. Character building, he'd say. You'd never see him do it, though. Flight had rules for everything. We were only young, never saw nothing of life, preparing probably to die. After training, all we wanted to do was to have fun. You know, but then Flight had his rules. And if you dared break them, you were in for it. You were really in for it. I think he must have been teetotal. In any event, he clearly wanted to make it difficult for us to go and have a pint. One of his rules was you weren't allowed to walk directly from the barracks to the mess. Distance, only about 100 yards. No, instead, he made us walk 2 miles all around the perimeter of the base to get to the mess. You can imagine the risk of getting lost in the dark on the way back, especially if you had one too many. Another rule Flight had, for our benefit, you understand, were the extracurricular tests on aircraft theory. One problem was the 2 with the lowest scores each week had to clean the lavatories. You might say that he was being cruel to be kind, but he made them use toothbrushes. Flight's pep talks became part of the weekly routine. Always the same message. Play the game with me, lads. He was menacing, and like little mice, we wouldn't dare squeak. All we knew was sooner or later there was going to be big trouble with him. Of course, we were starting to learn to fly aeroplanes, and sooner or later we all achieved that great achievement of going solo. The more we learned, the more Flight became irritable. The more he bullied and picked on the loners mainly. The more he bullied and he picked on the loners mainly. One day, Flight screamed right in the face of an Asian lad from Kerala in India. I remember Hindipal Buri was his name. He was small and quiet. Flight towered over him and screamed a load of spittle in his face. Do you understand English? The response was delivered without a trace of fear that Flight had hoped to create. Oh, absolutely no problem whatsoever, he replied in crisp Oxbridge accent. That was the first time I saw Flight lost for words. We saw poor Hindipal doing circuits of the camp. We tried to speak to him, but he just shook his head, said nothing. I think his fear was more for us than him. He was there again on the following nights, then suddenly he left. After training, we discovered his bunk was empty. Blankets neatly folded as always. We never saw Hindipal again. It seemed inevitable that one day the Aussies would come into conflict with Flight. The day arrived when he caught some of them coming back the short way round from the bar at night. Stupid fools, they were a bit drunk and drawn attention to themselves by singing that comical version of Waltzing Matilda. Anyway, Flight got angry with them and said that all Aussies in the camp, together with one obviously innocent black man who just happened to be passing, were all banned from going to the mess. You know, those Aussies weren't scared of anyone. The following morning they started on Flight. They rounded on him and told him when he was inspecting the showers where he could stick his bar of soap. Flight went bonkers. He screamed. He shouted. His face went purple. His eyes were bulging. I was petrified. Flight must have realised the disturbance he had caused. His voice lowered with menace. He ordered the lot of us out on parade that evening. That gave us a whole day to wonder what punishments he lined up for us. Eventually, dusk fell. We lined up, standing at ease. Flight began reasonably enough, but we guessed what was coming. By degrees, his voice grew louder and louder, booming, growling, and ranting like a madman. How ungrateful we were. How unruly we were. He was in charge. He wouldn't have insubordination in his ranks. Never seen the likes of us. He wouldn't put up with it anymore. If we wanted to learn the hard way, he'd arrange it. He'd make sure it's hard for us. He raved, with his mouth dribbling and his hands waving. The things he said got more and more ridiculous. We had to promise to play the game. We, his trainees, had betrayed him. Betrayed all he'd done for us. Betrayed his hopes. Now, we were going to suffer the punishments, but all for our own good, of course. For no reason, Flight rounded on the innocent man caught up with the Aussies. It was so unfair. Flight eyeballed him closely and shouted incomprehensible things at him. Flight stopped all of a sudden. He adopted a central position in front of us. Everything fell silent, except for the sound of the wind rustling through the wire fence. There was a pause. Calmness descended upon Flight's face as he surveyed us, and he looked at us with disgust. And then he bellowed, "Attention!" Even now, I can't explain why this happened, but not one of us moved, not even an inch. Nobody said a word. We acted as one, as if all had silently agreed to do nothing. All day there hadn't been a hint of dissent. Fear? Yeah, plenty. But dissent? That was unheard of. Something had happened between us, all of us, that very instant. And I've no idea what it was. But no one moved. Then the order came again, louder, still this time with menace. "Attention!" Again. Nobody moved. He glared. Sweat trickled down his forehead, though it was freezing. Cold vapour was pouring from his dribbling mouth. He wiped it with his sleeve. For a moment, in his face, just a flash of uncertainty. Then as suddenly as he had stopped a moment ago, Flight went totally berserk. He shouted, he screamed, his arms waved. By contrast, we did nothing. We just stared back with defiance, or perhaps a bit of pity. I'm really not sure, but probably both. Opposite the parade ground stood the sergeant's mess. Hearing the commotion, out came several of them to see what was happening. They paused to take in what was going on. Then, like us, seemed to decide as one. They moved towards the failing lunatic. I thought they would seek to calm him, discover the reason for his rage. Then we'd be in big trouble. To my surprise, without saying a word, the three picked him up and physically carried him into the mess, his arms still flailing, voice ranting as he was carried away. Still on the parade ground we remained, wondering what to do. The squadron leader emerged from the mess. I dreaded what he'd say to us, and I was convinced we were in big trouble. Quietly, he told us to return to our barracks. I have never since understood how all of us, independently and quite spontaneously, decided as one to defy Flight. But the most remarkable thing was perhaps that there was absolutely no response to our mutiny. Later we heard that Flight had experienced some kind of mental breakdown and had been placed in a psychiatric hospital. Part of me felt a bit sorry for him, but that soon passed. To my relief, he never came back. The petty rules and punishments disappeared overnight. He was replaced by another flight sergeant called Macduff, a Scot with masses of freckles and red hair. Being a skilled piper, he liked nothing better than to lead us round the airfield, him in front playing his pipes and us marching to his music. Very occasionally, he used to let us do a rendition of that comical Waltzing Matilda song. I must say, I've never experienced it. Marching to bagpipes out in the open air can be quite magical. Anyway, that's all the discipline we got from Macduff. That's the end of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Cheerio.